Hey everyone, Peter Zine here, coming to you from home in Colorado. We're going to start off this new series with what I've learned during the Ukraine war to this point. Specifically, now that I've had a little bit of time to kind of step back and reassess. It's been about 5 weeks since I talked about the war in general. We're now going to talk about where we are today. The single biggest takeaway of the last 5 weeks is that everything, and I mean everything that the Russians were bad at before, propaganda, logistics, precision, training, maintenance, equipment, everything that they were bad at before, they're worse now. The Russian offensive has stalled pretty much everywhere, and there's two big reasons for this. The first, and the most spectacularly, and in many ways impressively, is that in the past 6 weeks, Ukraine has shifted the type of war that it is fighting. They've gone from predominantly trying to arrest the Russian advance with things like Stingers and Javelins, shoulder-mounted weapons, to an ever-increasing number and ever-increasing style, heavier artillery. That has enabled Ukraine to increasingly strike deep behind enemy lines, blow up ammo dumps, destroy logistical hubs, damage infrastructure, and even get to the point of assassinating military leadership. Some of the Wagner bases, these are Russia's mercenaries, have been just destroyed. In other places, they've found out that a number of officers were getting together for a happy hour and they hit the bar. The degree to which the Ukrainians are able to put targeting information either from their own human network or signal intelligence that is provided by the Americans and put it to use has been very impressive, and it has snarled the entirety of the Russian advance in both the east and the south. Second, and perhaps even a little bit more significantly than the Ukrainian increasing battle prowess, is that Russia may be running out of ammunition. Now, the Russians don't fight wars like most modern militaries, certainly not like the United States. The United States does high impact, long range, deep penetration to prevent the front from ever even forming. That's not how the Russians do it. The Russians use trains to supply a nearly bottomless supply of materiel and fuel and ammo to the front line, and then they assault the entire front line with a massive amount of artillery, destroying everything they see in their path and incrementally advancing maybe a mile a day. Now, Russian maintenance of anything has never been great, especially in the post-Soviet system, and explosives, like food, have use-by dates. Typically for artillery shells, you don't want to use anything that's more than 20, 25 years old. Well, Russia really hasn't built much in the last 30 years. We don't know a huge amount about Russian conventional forces because they're not sharing the data, but we do know that they faced a massive industrial collapse in the 1990s that they never really recovered from. And they have fought 3 artillery-intensive wars since the Soviet collapse, 2 in Chechnya and then 1 in Syria. So now the Russians are attempting to advance over a front that's 1,000 miles long, with a burn rate for their artillery in excess of 40,000 shells a day, going through a relatively small, by Soviet standards, arsenal that has been acquired since the Soviet collapse, when the industrial system collapsed as well. Any equipment, any shells that they're going to use that are not from that stack are things that were built before 1989, meaning that they're in excess of 30 years old. We've seen reports several a year in Russia going back 30 years that every once in a while one of these shells, because it falls or just has a problem, cooks off, and the entire ammo dump goes up. It's entirely possible that some of the explosions we're seeing in places like Beograd or Western Russia are not actually being caused by the Ukrainians, but by the Russians' manhandling of their own equipment. But regardless, that burn rate, 40,000 a day, is not something that anyone could maintain at length. So while the Ukrainians have been using more and more artillery with higher and higher range and more accuracy, more and more intelligently, Russia's been shifting in the other direction, using older and older shells, which have a higher chance of blowing up in the barrel or not detonating when they actually arrive. And the logistical trail of getting that stuff to the front is getting longer and longer and more disrupted. So rather than the broad, if slow, advances behind a hail of artillery like we were seeing out of the Russians in May and June and early July when I last addressed this topic, instead Russia has been hitting high-profile targets such as train stations and malls, big static things. But those attacks have the feeling of being a little bit more than the Russians shooting at things to demonstrate to the world that the Russians can still shoot at things. tanks and infantry are not following up on any of these attacks. Whereas with the Ukrainians, they've very clearly been setting the stage for something much more significant. That much more significant is now on play. On August 29, the Ukrainians began what they claim to be is a significant military offensive to recapture the Kherson region. Now, for those of you who remember back to the beginning of the war, Kherson was the only major city that the Ukrainians ever lost to the Russians. It's the only regional capital, and it was a bit of a surprise because it is in a relatively defensible position on the north side of the Dnieper River. We'll talk about that here in a minute, but first, all the normal things that plague offensives are appropriate to think about here. They trigger higher casualties among the attackers and the defenders. They require more troops. They require better logistics. They're more vulnerable to disruption. All of that stands. Also, you have to consider that this isn't simply Ukraine's first significant offensive in the war, but this is Ukraine's first significant offensive ever. Russia first captured Kiev in the 1600s, and it has been under some flavor of Russian administration almost the entire time since then. There is no national history of military conflict in Ukraine independent of its position as a cog within the Russian system. So all the concerns that people have about whether the Ukrainians can carry the water on this, all relevant. But two things matter. The Ukrainians have continually surprised to the upside, and the Russians have continually surprised to the downside. So what should have been a wildly unbalanced war that should have been over 4 months ago, all of a sudden, if not a conflict among equals, is suddenly looking like a little bit more of a fair-ish fight. And that means we have to look at what's going on in Kherson. First of all, where is it? Here's a map we've pulled from the Institute for the Study of War, which is brilliant. Anything in red is a territory that the Russians have captured since the beginning of this conflict, which began back in 2014. The zones that are outlined in black are the territories the Russians captured in the last war, and everything with the red outline are the territories that they've captured since February 22, when this war began. The most important thing to note there is that Kherson is in the extreme western part of the section that the Russians have captured. And you'll notice that double red line coming down just to the northeast of Kherson. That's the Dnieper River. And let me show you why that is significant. Here we are looking at southern Ukraine. To give you an idea of just where everything is, the red line down at the bottom, everything south of that is the Crimean Peninsula. Those are territories that the Russians have controlled more or less since 2014. You move north of that, and everything that is to the south and east of this big swath of water, that's the Dnieper River, is under Russian control pretty firmly. You go further east on here, you will see eventually we will hit Mariupol. There just to the west of that yellow line. Back over to Kherson. Now, the one place where the Russians have succeeded in crossing the Dnieper River is at Kherson and Kakova, which are right here. Kherson's with the red and Kakova is up river a little bit. And they control most of the territory just to the north of this zone. In fact, they made it almost all the way to Mykolaiv, which is this little city up here in the northwest of Kherson. Now, normally, if you were to tell me that the Ukrainians were attacking the Russians and their smaller population with a smaller military with less equipment and less training, I would have just kind of laughed it off. It's one of the reasons why I was one of the people who thought that the war would have been over by now with the Russian victory. Thankfully, I was wrong. But what is in play here is a little bit different. And I would like to think that if I saw this specific fight brewing a few months ago, that I would have given more or less the same assessment. Let's zoom in on Kherson so you can see what I'm talking about. River City, it's the final packaging port, it's kind of their New Orleans. But you'll notice that in the river here, there's nothing crossing it. In fact, you have to come up here to the far eastern rinks of the city before you hit the only bridge in Kherson. And this is a bridge that the Ukrainians have been hitting off and on for the last few weeks with some of those high range, high accuracy artillery rounds. So the bridge is still standing, but it is now close to heavy equipment traffic because it is no longer structurally sound enough to take, say, a tank. It can still take civilian traffic, but that's about it. The next bridge upriver is not until you reach Novokakova, right here, which doubles as a flood control lake for what is basically a reservoir up here. And once you're done with that one, the next bridge up is all the way up here at Zaporizhzhia. So that's it. Those are the three lowest bridges right here. Those are the three lowest bridges on the river. And any equipment that the Russians want to get to the north side of the river has to cross through one of those 3 points, really one of the two that are down in Kherson specifically, or Kherson and Kakova. So the Ukrainians have damaged those bridges so they can't be used for heavy equipment transfer, which means that the forces that are north of the river abutting Russian or Ukrainian forces in Ukrainian territory have to be able to get by with what they have already. Anything else has to be reloaded out of a heavy vehicle and into a smaller truck to be brought north. And that means in terms of the battle of forces, the Ukrainians have a very strong force advantage here. I'm not predicting that they're going to be able to pull this off. I'm saying that this is like one place where if you're going to go through some teething pains in terms of learning how to do an offensive against the Russians, this is where you would do it. And that's where they are doing it. There's also another complication here for the Russians. If it proves that the Ukrainians are successful and the Ukrainians are closing in on Kherson and Kakova, Russian forces are going to have to evacuate on foot. They are going to have to leave all of their gear behind. And unlike the American and the Swedish and the German gear that we have to train up the Ukrainians one squad at a time, everyone in the Ukrainian military knows how to use old Russian equipment. This would be the single biggest military transfer to Ukraine of the post-war environment, and certainly of this war. It's difficult to come up with something that would not just be a bigger strategic or morale victory, but an actually victory in terms of the availability of material. All of a sudden, the Ukrainians might actually have what they need. So that's kind of the first big piece of this, that this is a realistic goal here for the Ukrainians. And then if they achieve it, they will get some outsized benefits. There's something more in play. Now, Novokakova is important not just because of the bridge, it's also important because of these two little things right here. What you're looking at here is a sluice gate that allows water to enter an irrigation canal. There's one right there at the city, and then there's one a little bit upstream. Now, the sole use for the water that's coming up here is for irrigation. And in fact, you can see it in play right by the gates. These are crop circles, not caused by aliens, definitely caused by irrigation. And if you follow that big canal all the way south, you eventually end up in Crimea, where that same canal, here it is right here, is used to distribute within Ukrainian territories, Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories in Crimea itself. Now, southern Ukraine has a similar moisture profile to western Kansas. So without irrigation, you're not going to grow anything except for a little bit of dry season wheat. If the Ukrainians succeed in capturing Kherson, they will be able to either blow up or shut off that sluice gate, which means that Crimea will be high and dry. Now, in a typical season, Crimea imports over 80% of its food, anything that is not dry season wheat, from Russia. If they're able to get that irrigation water in, they're self-sufficient. So you're talking about a population of 2 million and the greatest concentration of Russian forces in Ukraine potentially being cut off from their normal food supplies. Now, they'd still be able to import food from Russia, but that brings us to the final point of this offensive. Because if the Russians lose Kherson, if the Ukrainians can get that far forward, then with some of the new equipment, the Ukrainians would be able to blow up a nice little bridge here that it looks like, yep, there it is. This is the Kerch Strait Bridge. This is a road and rail combined piece of infrastructure, and at present, it is the only uninterrupted rail line that links Russia proper to Russian-occupied Ukraine. Now remember, the Russians suck at logistics. They're not very good at moving things by truck. Sometimes they actually have to unpack their artillery shells from their casings and move them a shell at a person, move the shells by hand one at a time into like civilian vehicles for distribution. It's ridiculous. They have to fight by rail. This is the only rail link that comes in. If you move further north into Ukraine proper, there are other road networks that go into places like Luhansk and Donetsk, but there is not a rail link that goes into those provinces and then drops back south of the river into the areas that the Russians are actually occupying. So it's Kerch or nothing. And if the Ukrainians are able to blow up Kerch, then all rail supply for the entire force outside of Donetsk and Luhansk themselves are suddenly lost. And Crimea goes from being an incredibly strategically valuable platform that the Russians can use to launch into Ukraine proper into the most significant military vulnerability that post-war Russia has ever had. That's what's at stake here. Now, again, this is not a forecast. This is a projection based on what their goals are and where the targets are. If you'd asked me if they had a chance at this 3 months ago, I would have laughed. And all of a sudden now, things have changed. The Russians have underperformed. The Ukrainians have overperformed. The West has really come through with some more advanced equipment. And the balance of forces in the regions in question really have shifted. If Ukraine is going to win this war, this is how it's going to start. Okay, that's it from me. See you guys next time.